Hello, we're on Unit 11 now about the Cold War. During the Cold War era of U.S. history, there's quite a competition between the two superpowers that emerged after World War II, which would include the United States and the USSR, otherwise known as the Soviet Union. It was a war that was waged on political and economic fronts, but there was always the all-out threat of nuclear war. So that was kind of a fearful time in world history, that's for sure. Satellite nations of the Soviet Union buffered the Soviet Union from on its western border. Places like Romania and Poland, they were places that were behind what they called the Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill kind of coined that term, which meant that they were under Soviet domination. Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union until 1953, and so we'll talk a little bit about the post-World War II era. Here we have the United Nations being formed in even before the war was at an end in 1945, and and an organization for tolerance and world peace, working towards that. They had um, the United Nations had the World Health Organization, they have UNICEF, they have the World Court, and of course they have the Security Council, which is the most powerful branch, and the General Assembly, which has any country in the world can have a member there. Two prominent U.S. Delegates that signed the charter in 1945 would include the former First Lady, uh, Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was a settlement house leader, and she was definitely an open-minded person, and went to San Francisco to join join the United Nations. And then just on a local front, we had Harold Stassen. He'd been the governor of Minnesota, our youngest governor, elected at the age of 31. He had stopped being governor to go and serve in World War II, and we see a picture of him here in his military uniform. He became the second of 8 delegates from the U.S. to sign the UN Charter. He would go on to other political, or run for a lot of political offices. In this shot here, we see some of the people from the vocabulary in number 1, Unit 11, which is on the Cold War chapter, and chapter 28, section 1 and section 2, and even going into section 3. We'll start with George Kennan, which is in the lower right-hand side. He suggested a policy. He was a Soviet expert, and it suggested a policy of containing communism, and this in particular was in relationship to Greece. You can kind of see in the background sort of a Soviet connection in the picture there, with the architecture, and then the chess game that he's playing between the Soviet Union represented by the red and the Kremlin, and then the capital being represented in the white chess figure there. In the upper left-hand corner, we have Bernard Baruch, and he was an advisor, presidential advisor, and he proposed penalties on countries who did not follow the international rules on inspection in atomic energy plants. And the Atomic Energy Act came out in 1946. It was created by the Atomic Energy Commission to oversee nuclear weapons research and promote peaceful uses of atomic energy, which of course I think we all would like peaceful uses, that's for sure. George Marshall was mentioned in the reading as well. He was big into this, well, a lot of different things about him. First of all, he was Franklin Roosevelt's chief of staff, so he was a general. And then when Truman was president, he asked George C. Marshall if he'd be the Secretary of State and deal with foreign relations. So he helped to come up with this European Recovery Act, otherwise known as the Marshall Plan, which pumps $17 billion in economic aid into Europe to combat communism, to promote capitalism, and especially to help the refugees from World War II. And this really, really did help a lot to get Europe's economy back on track, and then help the people that were homeless to find places to live. There were a lot of helps to the local population there. We also have a picture of President Truman, which you'll see him again. Harry S. Truman came the doctrine was named for him. It was a policy of the U.S. to support free peoples who are resisting subjugation by communism by loaning them money. In particular, we did help, the United States did help Greece, and we helped Turkey through this Truman Doctrine. We have a picture of the Truman Doctrine down at the lower left-hand corner with Greece and Turkey being helped by the Truman Doctrine. In the upper left-hand corner, the Berlin Airlift. Well, we have, well, you should go over to the picture on the right where Germany was divided, and this was mentioned in section 1 of chapter 28. Germany was divided into 4 different divisions. East Germany was administrated by the Soviet Union so that Germany wouldn't rise up again and become a militaristic power. And then the western part of Germany was carved up into 3 different zones controlled by the British, the French, and the United States, who the Allied powers. And so anyway, East Germany was under communist or Soviet domination. Berlin, as well as the capital, was the capital, and it was divided into 4 different regions as well to be administrated. And the Berlin Airlift happened in 1948 into 1949 when the Soviets blacked out roads, canals, and railroads into Berlin in 1948 to drive Western powers out of Berlin so that the Soviet Union would have total control of the capital. Okay, well, the United States and Great Britain airlifted supplies in from June of 1948 into May of 1949, coal and food, etc. Even some of the pilots worked up little parachutes for Hershey bars and gum, juicy fruit gum, and as they approached landing in Berlin, they opened the windows and they threw out these little parachuted Hershey bars and um, let's see, gum over schoolyards, etc., for the kids to catch. And because they had little parachutes, it was safe to do. So anyway, that was pretty cool. And so the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Stalin, realized that because of the Berlin airlift, this blockade of Berlin wasn't going to work out very well. So they lifted that sanction. All right. So anyway, uh, we'll move on to talking about the alliances. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed in 1949, and this is part of number 1 in the Unit 11 packet. So if you jot down at least 2 members, as you can see in the list on the left-hand side, there's quite a few. Alliances, members of the alliance. And then on the Warsaw Pact, kind of a cool symbol there as well. This was decided in 1955, a military alliance. If you could write down 2 of those members, of course, the most prominent being the USSR, and then its other satellite nations that are shown there as well. So anyway, military alliances, yeah. All right. Moving up to what we'll be talking about related to the Korean War, where the Cold War turns hot. President Truman thought one of the big advised things to him during World War II was that, okay, people are fighting in segregated units. And he said, we're going to change this. So he offered up Executive Order 9981, which wipes out segregation in the armed forces. And this really helped when we got in a war in Korea and the Korean conflict as part of the United Nations forces, because then it really raised morale, more of a team effort instead of African Americans having to do just menial jobs. They actually got to fight in combat. More full members are accepted as full members in the military, not subservient. And so anyway, that was a really big thing. But also Japanese Americans had fought in segregated units. Americans had fought in segregated units, and so this changed under Truman, and this is a really big thing. Moving on to talk a little bit about the Korean War, which is coming up in our section 3, we have North or Korea being administrated after World War II. Japan, of course, was being rebuilt after the war, and it was administrated by the United States and the Soviet Union. And because Korea had been taken over, it was also administrated, the northern part by the Soviet Union and the southern part by the United States. They had 2 different rulers, Kim Il-sung for the north and Syngman Rhee for the south. And in 1949, China became a communist country, and so anyway, that was a big worry for the United States because the Soviet Union was already communist. Now China, the biggest country in the world population-wise, so there was a big fear about communism spreading around the world, and so the Korean peninsula was just sort of a microcosm, and why the United States, people of the United States, and maybe other countries in the world as well, were fearful of communism is they thought that people would lose their way of life, capitalism, they would lose the competition, opportunity to be able to do their own job. I mean, to choose their own jobs and where they wanted to live, personal ownership of property. So that was the fear. And then, of course, we have the fear of nuclear war all the time because we have nuclear weapons present. Harry S. Truman, of course, was the only president that we've had that has used nuclear bombs in war, and hopefully the only one we'll ever have to have. But he made a tough decision and followed through on that. In 1952, he did not run for election, and the 34th president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, became president of the United States, and he helped to end the war in Korea. But we'll have more on that tomorrow. Harry S. Truman was somewhat unpopular because he had fired Douglas MacArthur, and Douglas MacArthur, of course, had exceeded Harry S. Truman's authority, which you're going to read about in section 3 of chapter 28 for tomorrow. Thanks for watching.